God bless you. Thank you.
All right, folks, we're going to give one more minute and then begin. Thank you all again for those who are here. And again, a year ago today is when you got news and the notice went out for many school districts that after spring break, kids were not coming back to school. And that's what it's been an amazing, incredible year full of lots of challenges, some triumphs, and
Hi everyone, it's great for us to be able to.
And we wanted to take that time for this moment and kind of honor that and talk about what it's been and what we've learned as we've gone along. So thank you all for being here, and we'll jump and get going. So first off, when we sent this out, we had a little bit of not only did we want to be helpful, but we wanted to hear from you. And we really tried to take some time to listen. And so we sent out a little informational, what's been some of the challenges you faced this year? What are you worried about? And tried to synthesize all that data into here, and just to kind of see you're not alone, and then to highlight some of that. So here's what, when we looked, first off, that there were about 161 people who responded. That number's gone up. And again, ranging from one child to 4 or more children, and the bulk of 50% of people had 2 or more kids. And again, in all different areas of school, the highest point, as you can see, is elementary school. And so the age of responses can vary. But what we heard is this, and I hope you all as parents can relate to some of this. So when I was growing up, there was the top 10 from David Letterman. And here are the top 10 things that you all as parents were reported as sort of challenges during the pandemic that you shared. And you can kind of see, first and foremost, motivation and engagement, keeping our kids motivated, then followed by e-learning issues. And if you combine those two, anxiety and depression, but mental health, first and foremost. Screen use is a big issue and continues to be. And irritability, our kids having some attitude, defiance, seeing my child change in the more of a negative way, the frequent schedule changes, and for parents, balancing e-learning and work. And I imagine many of you can relate to that. So just to kind of see you're not alone, and that's what I'm going to talk a little bit more about today, are some tips and tricks around some of these things that you're sharing are challenges. And then some honorable mentions that I can also relate to, just grades dropping, hopelessness and burnout, limited activities, peer issues, making social isolation, we'll talk about as the number one. Oh, I missed that. Social isolation is number one, and lying and trust. And again, that shows up for a lot of parents reporting now they're checking their kids' grades, how did it go online, and then the kid says, oh, it went great. And then you get that email from the teacher that they're missing 5 assignments, and it's just eroded that trust. And so you can just see, and I bet you many of you in this room could be shaking your head that you've been dealing with this stuff. And what are you all concerned about parents reporting sort of moving forward? So number one in that top 10, drum roll, is mental health. That's where most parents are worried right now. And then the impact of education, the year that's been, and all the hardship and e-learning, what is it doing to my child's education, their future, and their long-term impact on on the family and social relationships. And many of you are kind of concerned about the transition back and what that will look like. So then you can see still screen time is on there and impact on educators. So there's sort of a lot of different things, but I bet you many of you can nod your head and relate to some of these issues. I know I have 3 kids right now, and some of these are similar issues that I've been dealing with through the last year. So, folks, first thing I want to talk about from day one, if any of you have been part of this journey with us, we've been talking or been sharing that this is sort of the worst marathon ever. And it's now moved on from just a regular old marathon, which is hard enough, to we're in this ultra marathon. And I want to highlight some things about the ultra marathon and highlight some of the things we learned. So, first and foremost, folks, kind of always being aware that we've always, been running different marathons, and that marathon is enlarged by COVID. I'm very blessed. My work was able to transition pretty seamlessly to telehealth. And so the ability to kind of work from home made things easier. And not everyone had that luxury or privilege. And things got exacerbated. And we've had to deal with loss. We've had to deal with so much in running. And so I just want to first acknowledge that we're all running a different race. And then when I look, because I wanted to look at, yes, we are running this ultra marathon. What do ultra marathoners say are some tips and tricks? So the first one you'll see is this idea of having a schedule. And again, when we first started the pandemic, we got way over scheduled. We thought we were going to kill it and crush it. And that didn't seem to work. It just put too much pressure and still does. And I still want parents to think about their pacing. Their pacing for themselves and their pacing that they're trying to set to their kids. And sort of in that scope of pacing, one of the things sort of kind of pushed and talk about with families is instead of having a very rigid schedule that's every hour, instead having a few key categories that are important to you or your family. So for us, it was always kind of pushing to do one thing a day for your mind. And for our kids, that was school. And one thing a day for their body, some form of exercise. And then something that was good for their soul, a passion area. And it's still really hard, as you saw, the number one issue is isolation, which we'll talk about some strategies, but trying to find ways to connect. And in reading what all your parents have written, one of the hardest things about that is especially the kids who transition to a new school in the pandemic, from middle to high school, from elementary to middle to switching schools. Many of you parents said, how my kid is not making those connections and I'm seeing their mental health suffer. And then again, because we are all stuck in the same house for these long periods of time, some of the parents and recommend adopted this sort of good citizen. What can you do once a day to kind of help make the house a better place? So a lot of times during COVID, that was my bigger kids helping my little kid learn to read, learn to do homework or things like that, cleaning up, whatever it might be. And then besides just the schedule and some tips for the schedule, ultra marathoners say it's really a good idea, folks, to not think about running the 100 miles, that doesn't work. And what they recommend doing is breaking every challenge down to smaller parts. I call that stair steps, to smaller tangible goals, making it to the first aid station, making it to mile whatever where there's water in a cooler, and not to get lost on the big race, but having tangible markers that we're looking forward to. So in this case, one of those tangible markers that's around the corner is spring break. And sort of looking at that and continuing to focus on just what's coming up and not thinking so much about big picture, how this is going to end. And then the last thing you'll see here is it's interesting, but I didn't know this about ultra marathon running, but pickle juice is a huge thing that helps. And so what I mean by that is there are some things that really help. And that's where mental health can kind of come in to give you some tips to help you run. And that's what I want to go over today. What might be the mental health equivalent of continued pickle juice to help you run? So the first thing I want to remind you all, and I see this more and more, that parenting is always going to be a balancing act. And that hasn't changed in COVID. It might feel different and more real, but you're always balancing what's in the well-being of my child versus safety. So back a year and a half ago before COVID, when your kid wanted to go to a party, you were balancing what are the risks and what are the benefits coupled with the safety, and kind of talking about harm reduction and ways to still have fun at the party, but what are some things you should be aware of? And if you really think about it, I know COVID feels different, but you still have to do that now. And here are the things we know is really important for well-being. That was part of the list you saw. Connection, getting exercise, feeling like you're accomplishing things, having emotional outlets, being aware of who you are, and being able to do. And what doesn't help mental health is the opposite. Dangers of getting hurt, helping kids avoid. And that's the thing. We could put them, everyone, in a little house and they could never get hurt or a little tiny thing. But again, that isn't good for their well-being or their development. And so that continues to be an issue now. And I want you to think about trusting yourself a little more in that parent instinct of the need and how to balance more than ever, because the consequences of just focusing on safety is not doing healthy things for your kid's mental health. And we know more about the virus too, and there's healthier ways. When this pandemic started a year ago, we didn't know as well how it spread. We were wiping down food. We were doing all these things that we've learned some stuff, and we've also learned how to help kids maybe connect in a safer way. So again, because isolation is number one, I want to give you some ideas to think about for isolation. So some of them you'll see is written, but then there's some others. Spending time with pets and animals is a great way to kind of avoid, especially for kids who are getting more isolated, to still connect. As I said, for kids who are moving to brand new schools, that's really hard. And maybe reaching out to the school about some smaller activities that they could do or ways to connect. Still, sports can play a huge role for my own kids. Having sports teams that are still going and outside and figuring out has been such an important part of their mental health that maybe if you haven't, still thinking about that. And one I just want to mention, I share it with every family who, especially if their kids are socially anxious, and every adult I work with, that improv is a way to practice and teach skills. And there are a ton of online improv groups, acting groups, different ways and online groups that you can connect if you really need to keep it safe. So thinking about that as another option to practice and get those skills fresh. And again, one of the things I would really continue to recommend is getting kids out of their bedroom. That, it's one thing if they're connecting and gaming and doing things, that's how kids are doing it this day. They might not be so isolated, but getting them to do it in more public spaces that you can interact and talk to. And again, thinking about their phone, and we'll talk about screen time, but it's important, how are they using it? And another thing, remember being social is a skill. And during the past year, your kids have gotten out of practice with that skill. I know my kids have. And so giving them opportunities to rehearse with you, to practice with you, and finding safe environments for them to practice is going to continue to be important as part of the reintegration and just being able to cope. So again, folks, another area that everyone kind of talked about was number two, is sort of motivation. And I want to give you some different ways to think about motivation. And the first thing you'll see is sort of that notion, one size does not fit all. So if you have multiple kids, the same thing is not going to work with each of them. So the first kind of thing we know about motivation is the old adage, you got a carrot and a stick. What are the rewards and what are the punishments that can help motivate? And again, what parents think about sometimes is they think, old model, sending kids to their room is a form of punishment. But maybe not. Now, with your kids having electronics and games and phones and all that, that might be the reward for them. That might be where they want to go. So, really thinking about what does your kid at this point not like to do to help motivate them, and what do they like to do, and what works better for your kid. So, I'm going to overshare a minute, but my 13-year-old has gotten way too comfortable in the pandemic and really actually can be alone and not interact with the soul and be good. So when she's not getting her work done, her actual punishment is making her hang out with people, making her be social, making her text her friends. And I know that seems counterintuitive, but again, it's knowing your kid and knowing what works. So that's one kind of way to think about motivation. Number two is slowing down and trying, they call it a functional analysis, where you really try to understand what is getting in the way of what you want to see. What are the barriers? What's keeping the behavior the same way? And that can be sort of a conversation, but a lot of parents are focused on academics, and online e-learning stinks. It's a huge barrier. And so trying to understand that with your kids and work on solutions that can help. And I would really recommend with that, if you can, and you feel safe, but finding ways to either just be present, to be able to be there, and that might be impossible with work. Maybe thinking about finding one classmate that they can sit and cohort together. That's been something families have done to success. But again, that kind of just presence, I think, is so important to help with motivation. And the last kind of way to think about motivation is this huge body of literature that kind of came out of the substance abuse work from mental health. And there are these two researchers who tried to figure out, why are we bad at helping people who struggle with substance use? And their theory and their realization is that in mental health, we typically think that everyone wants to change that behavior, that that behavior is a bad thing. And that's called stages of change. And what they realize is that people go through their own natural change process. And if they don't think it's a problem, if they don't think their grades are a problem or the e-learning is a problem in the sense that they need to do better, they're not going to change their behavior. So pushing them and telling them how to change when they're not in that space is not going to work well. So good parenting slash good help when someone's not motivated is to understand where they are in that natural change process. And if they are in denial, if they don't think it's an issue, your work isn't then giving them a plan of how to do it. Your work is helping them really contemplate the pros and cons, or think about how is this getting in the way of what they want, their own future goals, their own abilities. And they call it learning to find the hook. And so that's there's a whole more we could talk about. But what goes better usually is, instead of telling your kids, this is how you do it, is sort of talking with them of how is this, what you are doing, getting in the way of your future hopes, your goals, and how it might impact you long term, and getting them to buy in and then come up with the right plan to help. So that's just a little bit about motivation. The next thing is, so we, during the course of the pandemic, really gave sort of these very poignant talks on different aspects of mental health. But what I want to share, I'm not going to do that tonight because there's just too many, but many of you are concerned about anxiety and depression in your kids. So what I want to kind of help you think about, this is sort of what I think about when I think of good mental health. So first off, it's about understanding what it is. What is the issue? And a lot of kids use language right now because they just don't understand. I'm depressed, I'm anxious. And maybe they are, but maybe what they're really trying to communicate is I'm frustrated, I'm lonely, I'm sad, I'm worried, I'm nervous. So sometimes part of mental health as parents is understanding what it is and what it's not. And then whatever it really is, if it is anxiety or depression, it's having tools that could help. But then it's about using those tools that you learn and practicing them so you can swim differently in the pool. And so I want you to kind of think about that first. Do I understand the issue? And the issue we'll start with is anxiety. Again, feel free, go back to our website. We have a much longer talk on each of these things. But a brief thing about what anxiety is. Anxiety is that part of your brain that's trying to protect you from cobras. It's the part of the brain that when it sees danger, if there is a cobra in your room, it's going to try to go off and get you to safety. And so with kids or with anyone, if anxiety, that part of their brain that sees danger, is keeping them from doing things, that's an anxiety problem. But sometimes they might say, I'm stressed or I'm anxious, and that's not a problem. That's a way they're trying to communicate. So one of the things is helping kids understand, and you all understand what anxiety is. It's that part of your brain that tells you what could go wrong. And if that part of your brain governs your behavior, it can lead to trouble. And so what we want to do, and we're in Colorado, and again, skiing is around the corner. What we want to do is learn with anxiety to teach kids some skills. And you can see some of those on the right, some of the things we might want to teach. And then once they have the skills, we got to get them on the mountain and practicing. And if we don't, their anxiety is not going to get better. The next one is depression. And a lot of kids are sad, they're lonely, they've gone through loss, they're isolated, and they may be depressed, but they might use that word too. And so I talk to kids, and to understand what depression is, I kind of talk about that depression is a virus, and that virus gets in you, kind of like in Harry Potter, again, like Dementor. And a dementor is the best example of what depression does. And I think that's what J.K. Rowling was trying to describe in it, because muggles can't see dementors. And they suck the life out of you. They replay the worst moments. You don't have any reason to live. And you just go and don't want to live anymore. And so there are things, if depression is what's going on, which can be very much what's happening right now, here are some of the things we really want to focus on. We want to reduce their isolation. We want to help them get outlets. We want them to understand how depression's talking in their head and stealing their soul, and learn their Patronus and how to fight back. We want to get them active and moving. And so if you're seeing depression, here are some of the key target areas that you want to do. So moving really fast. Whew, I want to give time to my colleague. So social media is a big thing. And the first thing, I call it kind of a screen plan. And we can go a lot. But one of the things to understand, to think of screen use as a tool. And you can use tools for good, or you can use tools poorly and get into trouble. And with the internet, really want you to be aware that you want to help kids learn how to use those tools and use them for social connection, to help, to reduce isolation. And one of the other things I really heard, which was great from another talk, was that kind of social screen use is sort of like the new cigarettes. In the sense, when our parents were growing up, everyone kind of would smoke. There were no regulations. We didn't know how bad it was for us. There was smoking in restaurants, on airplanes, and there were no rules. It was kind of like the Wild West. And we had to sort of, in that way, develop the rules. We had to figure out what was okay and not okay. What's not okay in the house, what is okay. When is it okay to smoke or not? And that may have changed, but we want to think of screen use the same way. Is it okay to have screens at the table? When is it okay to be online? I really talk about with my kids that social media and their screens are a reward. They have to use it for school, but it's their dessert, and you don't get to use your dessert before your vegetables. So there's different kind of conversations, and think about, you want to start thinking about a contract, but depending on the age, you want to engage your kids in that contract. Whew, going through a lot. So the last area I want you to think about that I think is really important is in all our harping about school and academics and what our kids are not doing and what's wrong and hard, it's very easy for relationships to get tense, to have issues. And also, it's really easy for our kids to not feel valued and understood. Folks, this is the worst pandemic that hopefully they'll have to experience, that I've experienced in my life. And it's been really hard. And I think for all of us to slow down, it's important to create more feeling of value, appreciation, and some positivity. But to help you do that, one of my colleagues at Anschutz sort of took this thing called the stress continuum and kind of added it to relationships. So agreeing is the relationship's great. It's feeling good. We're laughing. We feel valued. Communication's open. Yellow, it's starting to feel tense and uncomfortable. We're having a short fuse. We're fighting. We're getting a little more disengaged. Injured as it's hurt. It really is causing problems. Every time we hang out, we're fighting. We want to not be around each other anymore. We're avoiding dinner tables. And red is we're critical, like we're really contemplating shipping my kid to boarding school, divorce, or different things. And so what I'd really encourage you to start doing is to kind of slow down and think about where your relationships are, especially with your kids and each other in the family. And if your relationships aren't good, how do we help get them back? How do we move them towards the green? So the first thing to kind of know, there's a really cool body of research by the name of by the name of Gary Chapman, who talks about there's these 5 love languages, and many of you may have heard of it. But the problem is we wind up speaking not our language to our partner, to our kids. We give them what our language is, not theirs. So there's some good apps and games, and you could type this in to understand what are your kids' love languages and to help bring some more positivity to tend it towards the green. Another is really focusing on what another researcher named Gottman talks about, your love maps. The more you know about your kids, the more you slow down and walk and hear their lives, dreams, hopes, that helps to increase that positivity, especially when you act on them. And learning how to reduce tension and conflict. And so one of the things I say to help do that, folks, and we don't have a ton of time, but imagine you were going to play a board game with your kid. What would be the first thing you do before you play the board game? You would go over the ground rules. What are the house rules? Well, how are we going to play Uno? And we have some rules for that in our house. And when you go to a different house, there's different rules. So I would encourage you to slow down. And before, if there's some tension going on, which is normal right now, many of you are feeling it, slow down and talk about the rules of how are we going to work? How are we going to engage? And then remember to stop trying to speak your language on your kids, on your partners, on whoever, and learn how to speak theirs. It'll be much more effective. So we don't have a ton of time, but want you to start thinking about that, being aware of where they might be on the spectrum, and try to come up with some ideas. Well, what are some things we can do to get back towards the green? And to think about that, one of my last suggestions is it's time to recycle, folks. We've been doing this for a year. And I know early on there were some things I was doing that were really great during the pandemic that I'm not doing anymore. And I still should be. I was going for walks with my kids, and we'll talk about that, checking in with them. I was reaching out to old friends and having Zoom calls. And I know we're all Zoom fatigued, but it still was a great thing. And I'm saying part of what might be good to help tend your relationships in your family back to the green is to go back and recycle and to go back to what might help. So the last thing, I promise, and I'm going to hand it over to my colleague. One of the things I want you to recycle is to learn how to talk to your kids again. And every week and over time, the topics may change based on, and here are the things I think that are important to talk about based on where we're at. So first off, I've been back to Harry Potter. I've been saying COVID is a lot like Voldemort. We want to pretend he might not even be here anymore. We want to be over him. We want to even not even talk about him. But Voldemort's still here, folks, and we got to talk about him and his impact. And the next person you'll see, that's Scott Miller, and it's a long story, but he talks about that good therapists take time to check in with their patients. And that's what I want you to do, not with your patients, but to check in with each other. And again, to talk about, now that we've run this ultra marathon for a year, to slow down and what's working. What do we need to change up? What should we bring back and recycle? And then still, a lot of parents want to tend towards the lemonade, to talk about what's good and the resiliency and all that. And that's wonderful, and I agree. But remember, we're still going through a lot of lemons. And again, one of the things I heard one of my colleagues share, and I love it, that a year for me at 44, to lose a year sucks. But an 8-year-old losing a year of third grade, a year of high school is so much bigger. And still want to take the time to address the lemonade and the lemons and to make space for both and to continue to acknowledge. So that's that kind of thing of checking in and going. And so the last thing I'll ask you to do, I gave you a lot really fast. I would love for you just to take a moment and slow down. And in your role as parent, I call a red light something you might stop doing based on what you heard today. A yellow, pat yourself on the back, I'm going to keep doing it. And agreeing is something I might start doing in my role as parent that I heard tonight that I liked. And either type it in the chat, write it down for yourself. And I know we flew through this, folks, so we're recording this and this will be on our website. And now I'm going to hand it over a little late to my esteemed colleague who's awesome, Amy Lopez. You all have been great.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Cypers. I wanted to go ahead and let you guys know that if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll try and get to some questions at the end. We also, at the end, are going to do breakout rooms where you can get some more individualized support around some questions you may have for your kids. But if you do have some questions, feel free to drop those into the chat and we'll try and get to them. Let me go ahead and share my screen here really quickly. And talk a little bit about, what are we doing? So Scott played that I'm Still Standing song. I think I had a different take on it. As you can see, I have a question mark of how are we doing? How are we doing a year later? And so again, a year ago, we all got together. COVID came to Colorado, and we got together to talk about what that was like and what could we do and how could we make ourselves feel safe and feel comfortable. We all had stay-at-home orders. There was fear and confusion, but we all said, you know what? We're all in this together. We're going to get through this together, and it's going to be great. And a year ago our talk a year ago, we said, you lower your expectations. That was my advice to you. This is going to be hard. It's going to be tough. There's no perfect parenting. And so you need to just do what you can to get through. And here we are a year later, and what has changed? And unfortunately, not a lot. And again, a year ago, we thought this was going to be an extended spring break. And by May, we would all be back to doing our own thing. The curve would be flattened and we could go about our life. And I don't think any of us thought that a year later, we'd be sitting here saying, really, not much has changed. So, Dr. Cypers talked about recycling. I'm going to recycle some of that advice again and say, again, let's keep our expectations low. Keep doing what you can, recognizing there's no perfect parenting, especially during a pandemic. But although I say that there is some hope, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. As Dr. Cypers mentioned, we know a lot more about this illness than we did a year ago. We have a vaccine, we know about treatments. Because we know more about how it spreads, we can make some of our own personal choices. And I think, unfortunately, for parents, I don't think the light at that end of the tunnel is going to come soon enough. Which creates this other dilemma to say, again, if we have hope, then why don't I feel any better? That if things really are looking up, then why do I feel like crap? And so we're going to talk about mental health. We're actually going to talk about trauma. We're going to talk about crisis and trauma and how that relates to where we are right now. I want to just start by saying, and I'll dive into this a little bit more, that being in a crisis is very different than trauma recovery. And it's very different from rebuilding. And unfortunately, I think a lot of us want to be in the rebuilding stage, and we're actually still in a crisis, which makes it really difficult to know how do we proceed. So this is data around what happens during the emotional response to a disaster, how we respond. And I want you to think about this. Actually comes from literature when there's a discrete episode, meaning like a hurricane or an earthquake or something very specific that has a starting and an ending. And so we have, again, the warning and the threat. We have the event. And after the event happens, there's actually all this really, again, heroic things that happen, that altruism is really high. We are all in this together, and the community comes together to support everyone. And I think, again, last April, we kind of saw that. Well, then it starts to get old. And I think we saw this over the summer, that it really started to get old, that people were tired of this crisis. They were tired of the pandemic. And so we moved into the disillusionment stage. And I think right now, a year in, we're right at the very bottom of that. I don't think people feel like we can get out of this. Now, again, even at the anniversary, maybe things start to get better and we can reconstruct. That would be great if our crisis were actually over. And that's the biggest dilemma we're facing, is that we can't get to recovery, we can't get to reconstruction because we're not out of the crisis yet. And I think the problem is we forget that. This becomes important, especially when we think about our kids and kind of our expectations of them. When we deal with crises, our primary focus is on physical safety and helping people to feel safe. Again, like I said, there's immediate survival needs, and then there's a desire to help and community support. Usually this is around 30 days. I want you to think about, again, like if there was a car accident. You would deal first with, is everybody okay? Is everybody safe? Who needs medical care? What do we need to do? It's not until after you've dealt with those that then you can move on to this trauma work, which is, wow, what have we just been through? And like I said, I think that people really want to be doing that complex work of processing the anger, the fear, the sadness, and all of the things that Dr. Cypers were talking about that you guys are concerned about with your kids. Again, we're trying to do that work when we don't know if we're safe yet, which creates this big dilemma of how do we do trauma work when we're still in a crisis. And so I think that's the dilemma, again, a lot of you guys said is, well, why am I not feeling any better? As much as I want to be out of the woods, and again, a lot of us really want to be in that reconstruction stage. We want to be rebuilding. We do want to be talking about college and prom and graduation, but we're not there yet. And I wish we were. I wish there was something I could do to give more hope that we're going to get there quicker or faster. But I also think that's why I came back to this original statement of how do we lower our expectations a little bit? How do we not worry as much about grades or assignments getting turned in or how much time they spend on YouTube when we're still in crisis mode? All of those things are great for reconstruction. Some of them are good for trauma recovery, but it's hard to do when we're in crisis. And so I think that's one of the messages I'd like you guys to take away from tonight is that we're actually still in crisis. Oops, sorry. You're saying, okay, we're still in crisis. That's lovely, Amy, but it sucks. And I don't want to keep going. And how in the heck do I keep going? And I think this first picture is what a lot of our lives feel like. And we have to do it without help because we're still in pandemic mode. I've told people, and I've said this a lot, that trying to do this happiness work, trying to find our strength and find our courage to go on right now is like swimming in a bathtub. Because some of the things that tend to make us feel better is to have these relationships and to interact with other people and to go to concerts and to go out to eat. And we can't use our normal coping skills. And so it's like trying to swim in a bathtub. A lot of you brought concerns to Dr. Cypers about that your kids aren't okay. But I have a question is, how are you doing? How are you doing? You know, and we all remember being on an airplane back when we could be on airplanes, and what the stewardess or the flight attendant might say to us, which is, if something happens, you put on your own oxygen mask first, right? So that you can help others put theirs on, because you need that strength and you need to be strong enough to help others. And I think as parents, sometimes we forget that we're so worried about our kids' mental health that when was the last time you asked yourself, how am I doing? Am I doing okay? Quick question for you guys, just a quick little poll. When was the last time you guys had time away from your kids? And again, that's a good and bad thing. I made the joke of, you know, in the past year, I've had lunch with my 8-year-old every day. On the downside, I've had lunch with my 8-year-old every day. It's a lot to take. We love our kids, but sometimes we want them to go away. You know, questions is, when was the last vacation you took? I myself am guilty of this, that in the past year, because I'm home, I haven't taken any vacation days because it's like, why not? I'm home anyway. Why not work? And it kind of hit me like, that's silly. I mean, I have nowhere to go, but does that mean I have to be working? Are those the only two choices? And then the biggest question is, and we're going to come back to this, is can you actually be okay if your kid isn't? And I think that's the dilemma for parents. So I want you to take a minute and just do a bit of self-reflection and say, what right now do you most need as a parent? Again, we're not talking about your kids. We're putting your own oxygen mask on first and saying, what would you like? Maybe more time to yourself. If so, let's think about how could you get that? One is, you know, thinking about risk assessment, that it may be worth sending your kid to soccer. They get some interaction, but then you also get an hour to yourself. Again, are you feeling comfortable getting help from your community? If grandma and grandpa have been vaccinated, maybe it's a great time for them to take the kids for a couple hours to the park and being able to ask for help. Maybe you need some time to manage your own anxiety because you are in crisis too, and trying to figure out what that means and what that looks like for you. And again, here are some ways that you can think about managing your own anxiety. And Dr. Cypers, again, can go into more about that in some of the videos he talked about that are on our website. Maybe help from others. You know, maybe you do need some help. Maybe you do need your kids or your partner to step up and help during this time. And then again, a big one that I think is really important is what you need is for your kids to feel better. So there are some things you can do, again, that maybe we don't care about grades. Maybe we say this year's a wash and we're not going to worry about it. Maybe you validate and support them. But the other thing I want you to consider is this notion, there's a statement out there, you can only be as happy as your unhappiest child. And I kind of say that's ridiculous, because they need you to be happy, to look up to. You need to be able to provide them hope. Now, that doesn't mean all the time, but if you kind of lower yourself down to say, I'm going to be as miserable as my kids, well, then where does the hope come from? So I know this is tough, and I know it's hard to feel okay when your kids don't feel okay, but I will let you know that one of the number one predictions of whether or not kids are happy is whether or not their parents are happy. And so I think that's important, is to say that there's some room for role modeling. How do we get through this? And if you're at the place where you're like, I can't do that for my kid, I don't want you to feel guilty. Let's talk about some strategies for getting you the help you need so that you can be the person in your family who holds that hope for everyone else. Again, I think, as Dr. Cypers mentioned, this comes down to finding the balance. And that may mean, again, that you have to do some things that initially you wouldn't do and take a safety risk so that you can find the balance. So maybe, again, like I said, you send your kids to soccer, even though it may not be completely safe, they need the interactions. You need the interactions. Maybe you do a neighborhood play date because you need the interactions. Again, going back to this notion of balancing your kids' needs with your own. Balancing being at work and being at home. You know, as I said, not only have people not taken vacation, we also have not been great about setting those boundaries and saying my workday is done. And I think, again, thinking about your partner relationship and how that's going in terms of parenting, which is a much longer, more complicated issue. I want to reiterate what Dr. Cypers said, is thinking about what has worked. And so in the survey that Dr. Cypers sent out, there was a question of what's been a surprise? What has been interesting or exciting or actually kind of nice about this pandemic? A lot of you talked about that the flexibility has been nice. It's actually been fun to spend time with the family. In a weird way, it's been nice to say no to outside commitments. You know, a lot of families said Christmas, oddly, even though it was small, was nice because we didn't have the additional pressures. And most importantly is that a lot of families remembered that they actually like each other. That then when they got to spend time together. And so going back to what Dr. Cypers said is, you know, this notion of how do we go back to what actually worked in March and April and May to get us through the crisis, because we're not out of the crisis. There's some strategies, and again, just to give you something to walk away with today, I want to bring in a lesson from the dialectical behavior therapy and the notion of opposite action. So where this comes from is the idea that our emotions help us, they motivate us to act. Unfortunately, our emotions are wired for kind of caveman times, so they're not always helpful. They don't always give us good information. So to say, if my emotion isn't helping, what could I do that might be different? One of the reasons I bring this up is there's been a lot of anger. That's unfortunately where we are. Remember that chart I just did, that there's a lot of anger in where we are right now. We're not compassionate, we're angry. And I would say, is that helping? Is being angry at the school, being angry at your neighbors, being angry at your boss, is that helping? If not, maybe the opposite might work. And it's an interesting concept, but some things to think about, that if your emotion is not helping you, it's not motivating you to make things better, what could you do? So again, if you're feeling angry, try compassion. You know, with your kids, if you're blowing up at them, to say, you know what, actually, come here, let me give you a hug. Let's sit down and have a cuddle really quick before I get mad at you for not cleaning your room. Again, if you're feeling sad, get active. You're feeling guilty about something like taking time off, do more of it. Again, as Dr. Cyber said, fear, do it anyway. If you're feeling overwhelmed, don't do more, actually do less. You're annoyed by your kids, go jump on the trampoline or go on a bike ride. And if you're lonely, interesting, go find some good alone time. Grab a book and some bubble bath and go spend some time by yourself. So again, thinking about how these things help. And at this point in the crisis, maybe we do need to do something different. So here's just something, again, to throw in your bag of tricks to try. I don't know if it'll work, but why not give it a go and see what happens? And then finally, just to remember, I want you guys to walk away with this, is to say, we're not out of the crisis yet, and it's not okay yet. And this is one of my favorite quotes from the Grand Budapest Hotel of, everything will be okay in the end. If it's not okay, it's not the end. And I think for a lot of you, you want this to be over and you're like, it's not okay. And that's because we're not out of the crisis yet. It's not over yet. But this also isn't forever. We just have to hang on a little bit longer, and maybe some of these strategies might work. So like Dr. Cypers, I'd like you to think about, as a parent, again, for your own mental health, what are the things maybe you'd like to stop doing? What's something you'd like to keep doing? And what's something maybe you could start doing? So just thinking about that for your own wellness, putting on your own oxygen mask, what are some of the things you could do? All right, we would like to invite you guys to ask us more questions. So first, we do have an evaluation. We're going to go ahead and put this in the chat, and we'd love to hear your feedback. But the second thing we're going to do is we also are going to go ahead and open it up to give you guys a chance to ask Dr. Cypers and I more specific questions, to vent, to talk to other parents, and just give you a few more minutes of whatever we can offer you. I will go ahead and put the link to the evaluation in the chat while Dr. Cypers is creating breakout rooms. If you'd like to talk about children's mental health, go ahead and go to breakout room 1. If you'd like to talk about adult or your own mental health, go ahead and go to breakout room 2. Before we do that, though, I see there is a chat. Is there anything in the chat? Is there a question in the chat that came up?
Yeah, I'll share. So first off, folks, in the same way, I grew up with the books Choose Your Own Adventure. And so if you want an adventure based on kind of how to support your kids and share and connect, you'll go, do you want to set it up, Amy? I don't want to mess it up. Can you set up the breakout rooms, or do I?
No, I actually can't. You have to do it.
Okay. Let participants choose. So I'm going to be in room 1 if you want to talk about parent issues with your kids. And if you just want parent support for your role of being a parent, you're going to go to breakout room 2. And that will be led by Amy. So you get to choose your own adventure. And Amy, one of the questions that came up, or a couple that I saw, one is, I really appreciate your messaging around not having the same expectations